Hello again, everybody. Very pleased to be here. And just carrying on with the conference theme of reflection and direction, I thought I'd take a sort of a nostalgic reflect back to basically where we've come from and what we've achieved as an industry. And so, starting off from a long way back, and before anyone yells out and says, hey, those things have got no tags and no Nate tags and all the rest of it, I'm being actually nostalgic with the photographs as well, because they were actually taken in 1993. I had those specially taken for our DQA program way back then. But if you look a long way back to before 1990, some of you here today will remember that really the velveting side of the industry was quite fragmented. And there's a lot of us in here today that can remember a way back to the very early 70s when it was even more fragmented. And in those days, we kind of just, we velveted it ourselves, or we might have had a vet down the road that knew a little bit about deer, and he would come and help every now and again. But by and large, it was left to our own devices. There were no rules to speak of back in those times. And so we talked to people, we watched what people were doing with their deer, and basically we went home and we tried to replicate that and basically do it ourselves. We got the snot whacked out of us most of the time and battered and bruised, but we carried on. But thankfully, back in those times as well, like I mentioned, there were a few vets around that were interested in deer and quickly became allies to most of the fledgling farmers that were around in those days, and we were able to get on with the job. There were veterinarians around who quickly became specialists in deer and all things deer and in velveting, so that helped things immensely. But to be fair, it was a real learning curve in those days for pretty much everyone involved. And remember, I'm talking way back in the early 70s. And at that time, too, things were changing quite fast. The deer industry was starting to take off. They're really rapidly expanding. There are a lot more deer farms around, a hell of a lot more deer around in those days. And the seasonal demand for deer to be velveted and velveted at the optimum time was outgrowing the ability of the veterinarians that were available in those days to actually to do the job. So it was in the late mid-80s, actually, to be fair, that a group of visionary, forward-thinking farmers got together with some veterinarians and some people from the Game Industry Board at the time and embarked on the pathway to eventually establish what is now the National Velvet Standards Body, the NVSB. And I might add here too that the formation and delivery of the NVSB has really been a shining light for the deer industry. Again, leading the way, thinking ahead, not just doing the bare minimum required, and as such actually gained huge respect right through the regulators from the old MAF, now MPI, and of course NAWAC. And there was a hell of a lot of water that went under the bridge during that time with those visionaries. During the formation of the NVSB, it was a huge task, took a lot of work and dedication to get it all up and running, and there were some big battles that had to be fought along the way. So it was built through a partnership eventually with the then Game Industry Board, the New Zealand Deer Farmers Association, the New Zealand Veterinary Association, Ministry of Ag and Forestry, the National Animal Welfare Advisory Committee, and it was founded under various acts like the ACVM and the old Animals Protection Act, which is now the Animal Welfare Act, along with some quite significant signatories from influential organisations. Of course, one of the key factors, or one of the big hurdles back then, was the use of drugs, the drugs to create analgesia for velvet removal. And those drugs were restricted veterinary medicine. So that was one of the huge hurdles that the industry had to overcome, to be able to use those. The other big one, of course, and I might add still was to have a system in place to ensure the continued health, safety and welfare of the animals that were being velveted. And that's still paramount today, without a doubt. So after a whole lot of work by those very dedicated people, the NVSB was formally introduced in time for the 93-94 velvet season. And it's a program or a system, if you like, set up all those years ago, and it's really served us very well. The concept of self-regulation has really been the winning formula for us all, but we can't sit back and rest on our laurels, and I've heard that a few times in the last couple of days with various other presentations. We certainly need to be mindful of that pioneering spirit of our forefathers and the veterinarians who initiated the NVSB at that time. We know that we're in a high-risk industry. There's no doubt about that, and we need to continually keep working hard if we're to stay ahead of that game. We need to be thinking ahead and thinking, what's the next thing we can do to make sure that our self-regulatory program, it can be made better. I said it last year and I'll say it again, from an animal welfare and environmental aspect, the deer industry and velveting has always been ahead of the game. Across all of those years, we've actually been the masters of our own destiny and considered by many as pioneers and innovators all along the way. Which brings me to the current day. And I thought you might be interested in a few stats that I've pulled out regarding velveting and velveters. Since the very first velvet season, 93-94, there's still 103 active velveters participating, registered in the NVSB. That's 26 years. Only downside to all that is we're all bloody 26 years older. But just as an aside to that, can I have a show of hands? How many of those people are actually in the room today? Look at that. Well done, guys. And there's still 331 active in the program that have been registered for more than 20 seasons. So is there another show of hands? Yeah, pretty cool. Last season saw a rise in the number of registered velveters to a total of 1,004 in the program, and in previous seasons that number had been in decline, and we believe that the introduction of the RCS was the reason for the increase in active numbers in this past season. So the current situation with the RCS audits, this last season 332 audits were allocated, 176 passed, 70 still waiting action, 32 have opted out, 1 pending, and 53 audits have been selected still to be done. You'd have noticed that 10% of those selected for audit have opted out, and that's fine. That's the individual's prerogative to do that. And as I explained last year, there's possibly a number of reasons why, including sold the farm, selling out, selling the deer. I've only got a few deer, I'm not going to bother to do it, or straight out, no, I'm not going to do it anyway. So looking at this season's audits, what's been different compared with the first season under RCS? Well, there was a greater level of compliance right across the board, and that was kind of expected, due, I believe, to the greater awareness. You know, there were more farmers that had more time to become familiar or be aware of the changes that were required. And I think too there was a bit of an element of realisation that this RCS stuff is not going away. It's a regulation, it's here to stay. So they've got on and done what was required. Looking through the data, it's been interesting to see that the most common non-compliant area of the audits to date this last season was that there were no floor plans posted to identify the clean zones within the shed, or the VSD had not been filled out correctly. And there's just a couple of examples of floor plans just to give you an idea. They don't have to be flash, probably ideally if they were laminated and pinned to the wall, but it just shows the auditors where the clean zones are in the shed. And also mentioned last year that in general, farmers had been absolutely great in the response to meeting the RCS requirements and making changes where required. And I actually say that again, I actually take my hat off to most farmers who've got on and got their facilities up to the requirements. For some, it's involved a hell of a lot of money. For some, it's involved building a new shed. For others, quite a bit of money. And for others, maybe not so much, or for some, nothing at all. But there's been some huge transformations across the board within the sheds around the country, not necessarily looking at these sheds from the outside, but the transformations inside have been quite mind-boggling, and we've got screeds and screeds of photos of inside and out. And like I said, just looking at the shed from the outside, you won't see many changes, but inside it's been quite amazing. Just on that note though, and I want to point out that once your shed has been passed at order, or once your shed is up to speed, that's not the end of it, okay? It's not the end of it at all. All sheds where velvet is removed must always be maintained to that standard during velvet removal. That'll be the wrong number. Please don't go to the effort to get everything up to speed and then sit back and think that that's the end. It's not. So for next season, the system will work the same as the previous 2 seasons. Another 300 plus audits will be selected. And the expectations are that more sheds would be compliant this next time round because of the time frame that's been leading up to these audits. The system will work the same. For instance, if you've not previously had an audit, you're not allocated an audit this coming season, then provided you've made the effort to meet the RCS requirements, you can still sign your VSD and still sell your velvet. I would caution though, just as I did last year at the conference, if you've not bothered to do anything to meet the RCS requirements, then think very carefully about signing a VSD. The VSD is a legal document and carries all the penalties associated with falsifying legal documents. I also mentioned last year that MPI would eventually come looking and randomly checking the audit program. They've actually said that they will start doing that in 2020. So the audit allocations will go out later this year, and we'll flag that in industry publications when that actually happens. But if you haven't had an audit, you haven't received any notification and you want an audit, then please just contact either Pam or myself, and we'll make sure that that your name goes on the list and you do get an audit. In the past season, our auditors have been trialling a brand new electronic device for the purposes of auditing the RCS, and some of you may have been subject to this. The idea is that once each audit is completed, regardless of the outcome, a copy of that audit, along with photographs of any non-compliant areas, is automatically electronically sent to both the auditor, to the farmer, and directly into our database. It's a great system when it works properly, and it hasn't always worked properly. We've had a few issues with the programs, to be fair. Works fine one day, doesn't work the next day. Microsoft have been blamed, the system's been blamed, fingers have been pointed everywhere. We've even had issues with our users at times. And to be fair, it's been a source of great frustration for us all, particularly the auditors and particularly for Pam and myself. Hasn't worked 100%, but we are assured that it will. I've heard that before. But once it is sorted, we intend to put the velvet removal audit process onto the same type of platform, same type of format, which will be great and will save one hell of a lot of data entry. I mentioned the system as being a source of great frustration, especially sometimes for our auditors, and with all due respects to all of our auditors, they've been working with paper-based systems for 25 years, it's in the 26th season, and some of these new electronic devices can be slightly extremely challenging for them at times. And I did get myself into a little bit of bother having a discussion with one of the auditors just recently. He was venting to me about these useless electronic devices and couldn't get them to work properly and wouldn't work properly. And so I suggested maybe that next time that he went out to audit a shed, he could take one of his youngest grandkids with him and he might be able to sort things out. So I thought it was funny, but it didn't actually go down all that well. But that's the name of the game. But we will get it right, and the whole thing is to make everything faster, easier, and like I said, save that data entry stuff. Just as an aside, while talking about the audits, I've actually been given a heads up by MPI in regard to MPI go out across the country each year and they do market access requirement audits, 1,200 of those during the year. And during last round of audits, they were on a farm that had some deer on it, or two farms actually that had deer on, and they found velveting drugs still on the farm, way outside the velveting season. And so the concern there was that not only did it have sort of serious repercussions, but the NVSB farmer was non-compliant with the NVSB because the drugs hadn't been returned. The vet is kind of compromised because he's signed off the book and reconciled the drugs, but the drugs were still there. And in one instance, the drugs were expired. And now I'm led to believe that the drug would still have therapeutic quantities. It may not work exactly the same, and the question there would be residues for an expired drug because you can no longer rely on the withholding period. So like I said, they've given us a heads up on this so far so that we can get the message out to everybody. And that message is it's simply not worth the risk of withholding velveting drugs on your farm for any other purpose other than velveting. So one of the gaps in the RCS system was identified during last season, and that was, well, what happens when velvet is picked up by a velvet road buyer, and what happens when a farmer delivers or takes his velvet to a velvet collection depot? How's all that tracked? And remembering that all velvet must meet the RCS requirements right up until entering the RMP premise, the risk management premise. So the NVSB conducted 4 trial audits during last season, 2 on road velvet buyers and 2 on velvet collection depots, mainly checking to see if our auditing systems fitted and served the required fields. The audits were successful. We picked up or identified some areas that needed changing, and therefore the NVSB's work will continue or expand beyond the farm gate, and will follow those processes right through the whole system, until it reaches the RMP premise. The work that the NVSB is putting in is to future-proof and protect the velvet industry. It's always been the aim. The industry continues to grow without a doubt. Consumers' expectations are ever increasing, and we've heard that a few times through the last 2 days of the conference as well. New Zealand and overseas governments are demanding improved processes around animal welfare and food safety, and that's not new. And it's our job as an industry not to just keep pace, but in fact keep a step ahead of all of those challenges. And I believe that, I know velvet producers have invested significantly in their businesses, and I believe that they have the right to ensure that all suppliers of velvet actually meet the required standards. And by working together, I'm sure we're going to be able to do that. Thanks for your time.